Imagine the sun beating down heavily over a horizon that seems to burn. The air shimmers as if made of molten glass. The temperature rises past 40 degrees, and the wind blowing from the desert doesn't cool, it cuts. Sand whirls upward, clinging to the skin like hot iron. In any other army, this would be the end. Men would collapse from dehydration before even meeting the enemy. But in the distance, a cloud of dust begins to move in formation. It's not a storm, it's Rome. An entire legion crosses the desert, thousands of men marching as one body, shields upright, the sun flashing off their armor, synchronized steps echoing like the heartbeat of a giant. They seem immune to the heat, almost supernatural. But what's happening there isn't a miracle. It's human engineering pushed to its limits. Rome knew that fighting in the desert wasn't just a matter of courage, it was a science. Every soldier, every drop of water, every piece of metal had a calculated function. Nothing was left to chance. The legions were walking laboratories of survival, designed to endure where no other people could. And the heat, which killed enemies before battle even began, became part of their strategy. The Romans learned to respect the desert when they began conquering North Africa and Syria. There, they realized that their most merciless enemy carried no sword. It was the sun. Armor that protected them in Germania now turned into fiery traps. Men fainted. Shields became too hot to hold. Rome, unwilling to accept defeat even from nature itself, began to study heat as if it were an invisible army.
Military engineers, the architecti, observed, measured, and adapted. They discovered that metal, when separated from the skin by layers of fabric and air, doesn't cook the body. It protects it. They created the subarmalis, a kind of padded vest made of linen and wool worn beneath the armor. It wasn't just to absorb blows, but to let heat dissipate. Between flesh and iron, air flowed like a natural ventilation system. It was the first principle of battle climate control, not to block heat, but to let it move. The most famous armor, the lorica segmentata, made of metal plates, wasn't always used under the blazing sun. In arid regions, many soldiers preferred the lorica hamada, the chainmail. Each iron ring allowed air to pass through, reducing heat buildup. It was heavier on paper, but more breathable in the field. Rome understood something many modern armies still ignore. The human body is a thermal machine, and its efficiency depends on balancing protection with cooling. But the heat didn't only come from outside. Marching under the sun with 30 kilograms of equipment meant the body itself became a furnace. And that's where the second Roman secret came in: hydration discipline. Every soldier carried a canteen, the lagungula, strapped to his belt. Inside, it was rarely filled with pure water. The most common liquid was pozca, a mixture of water, vinegar, and sometimes aromatic herbs. Its taste was bitter, but its effect essential. The vinegar prevented bacterial growth and helped absorb minerals. It was the ancient version of an isotonic drink. Drinking wasn't an act of freedom, it was a command. The centurion dictated the intervals, the rhythm, and the quantity. A soldier who drank too much weakened his body, diluting the salt in his blood. One who drank too little dehydrated and collapsed. In the desert, any mistake cost a life. Thirst was treated as an enemy, and the control of water was as sacred as command over the sword.
Even the march was designed for the heat. It began before sunrise, when the sand didn't yet burn their feet. Each step was measured, steady, with regular pauses to reorganize the group. At noon, the legion would set up camp, Triangular leather tents, papiliones, erected in perfect formation. The trenches dug around them served not only as defense, but also to channel the wind, creating air currents that crossed the camp and lowered the temperature. The Romans had turned the desert into a controlled machine. But the sun didn't stop. The metal grew hotter, shields burned their hands, and still the ranks stood motionless. Roman strength didn't lie only in the sword, but in the mind. Discipline was an invisible air conditioner. Every order, every movement was synchronized to conserve energy. The body didn't panic, it obeyed. And then, when the enemy appeared in the distance, choking in the heat, Rome was already ready. They saw men covered in iron, standing beneath the deadly sun, and thought they were facing gods. They didn't know they were facing something worse, a system that did not break. The heat killed the weak, but Rome learned to turn it into part of the war. Every ray of sunlight, every drop of sweat, every shadow cast by a shield was part of a calculation. No movement was instinct, everything was strategy. And in that world of sand and fire, the empire that ruled seas and mountains also conquered the oldest enemy of all, the sun itself. The sound of Roman sandals over the burning ground was almost hypnotic. 1,000 identical steps, one single rhythm. No soldier looked to the side. No gesture strayed from the pattern. That uniformity wasn't just a symbol of obedience. It was survival. In the desert, a man alone died within hours. A synchronized army created its own microclimate.
The shadow cast by the frontline shields was shared by those behind. Heat was divided, as if it were a physical burden. The sun beat down, but the reflection from the armor and the geometry of the formations reduced the temperature within the legion. Each row was a wall against the heat, living, moving architecture. Formations shifted as the sun changed position. When it rose to its zenith, the testudo, the famous tortoise formation, was used not only to repel arrows, but to create shade. The front and top ranks raised their shields like a portable roof. Inside, air circulated in small currents, and even stifling as it was better than facing the naked sun. The Roman understood that thermal fatigue could be as lethal as the enemy itself. The Roman mind treated heat as it treated any other threat, with system. There was hierarchy even in suffering. When a soldier's body began to weaken, he wasn't left to fall. He was immediately replaced within the formation. Centurions knew that heat did not forgive pride. There was no shame in stepping back, only method. Rome trained self-control the same way it trained the sword. But true genius lay in the details. The sandals, caligae, were open and ventilated. The leather tanned in oil and animal fat to withstand the heat without shrinking. The iron nails on the soles, the hobnails, were not standard in every unit. In deserts, they were reduced to prevent the heated metal from burning the soles of their feet. Some legionaries wrapped their feet in damp cloth before putting them on. Everything was improvised, but based on centuries of experience. The body was trained to endure the heat, but also to understand its limits. Roman training wasn't just physical, it was physiological. Marches were planned to force the body to adapt gradually. Drills were performed wearing real armor, under the blazing sun for weeks. Soldiers learned to recognize subtle signs, dryness in the mouth, trembling hands, the rhythm of the pulse. They learned when to stop, when to breathe slowly, when to drink, and most importantly, when to obey silence. Silence was vital. Shouting under the dry sun increased water loss. The centurion gave commands with gestures and standards. Heat was fought with economy, of words, of strength, of everything. Rome was a machine that moved only when necessary. Every man was part of a system so precise it seemed unnatural. The daily camps followed the same logic. Every 20 or 25 kilometers, the legion stopped to build a temporary city. Ditches, palisades, tents, all in exactly 2 hours. The layout of the tents was never random. There was a defined solar orientation. The command and officers' tents stood in areas shaded during the afternoon. The grain and water stores were kept under damp tarps and near shallow trenches that channeled the wind. The camp center functioned like a thermal well, holding the cool air from the night. The engineers called it ventus servatus, the guarded wind. A simple concept, the cold air of the night, trapped in the lower layers of soil and beneath the tents, became a reserve for the next day. As the sun began to rise, the heat was blocked by wet cloths and double-layered leather structures. The rows of tents created corridors of shade between them, where the wind passed as through tunnels. Rome didn't need modern physics to understand. It discovered thermodynamics through instinct and observation. Heat rises, cool air falls. Simple. And everything, from the height of the tents to the spacing between rows, was designed to obey that principle. Even their diet followed the same logic. Eating too much under extreme heat was suicide. The body diverted blood to the stomach and the soldier fainted. That's why the main meals were eaten at night, and daytime rations were light. Grains, lentils, salted meat, a bit of diluted wine. The diet was functional, designed to preserve energy and prevent decay. Roman soldiers did not eat for pleasure, but for performance. Taste was irrelevant. What mattered was safety. A single piece of poorly cured meat could wipe out 100 men. That's why every legion had specialists responsible for supervising food preparation. They were the coccus legionaries, a kind of cook physician, trained to select what could withstand the sun. Diluted wine and vinegar weren't luxuries. They were liquid antibiotics. Their acidity fought microorganisms and preserved food. Rome didn't know the word bacteria, but it knew their effects. Wisdom came from repetition. What didn't kill today became tomorrow's law. The sun, which for any other army was an absolute enemy, became Rome's teacher. Every campaign fought in hot climates was a lesson recorded, studied, and replicated. The legion wasn't just a military force, it was a moving university. And with every war it won, it became more prepared to conquer its own body.
Heat, once seen as divine punishment, turned into a political tool. To march under the sun and not fall was a message. Rome is stronger than nature. Desert peoples, used to watching invaders collapse before reaching them, saw those men of iron advancing and believed the gods had changed sides. And in a way, they had. Because Rome learned something no god ever teaches, that the human body, when trained with method, can defy even the sun. When the enemy saw Rome approaching, the first thought was always the same. They're insane. Who in their right mind would march covered in iron under that sun? Who would fight under 40 degrees with shields that turned into ovens? The desert had already defeated entire armies before battle even began. Persians, Greeks, Levantine tribes, all had fallen to the same invisible foe, heat. But the Romans came differently, silent, organized, unstoppable. The legion's thermal endurance was so extraordinary that enemy chroniclers described Roman marches as living lines of metal. With every advance, the metallic rhythm of their armor echoed over the wind, and the local armies, accustomed to the chaos of desert warfare, lost their morale before drawing their swords. Rome knew this. Heat wasn't just an obstacle, it was theater. Heat could kill, but it could also humiliate. While enemy soldiers sought shade and rest, the legionaries kept marching, slow but steady. That slowness was calculated. Every step taken under the sun carried a message. We do not break. It was a ritual of domination without words. Roman generals used time itself as a psychological weapon. They knew the enemy weakened during the hottest hours, when the body demanded rest. Rome did the opposite. It marched precisely when no one else dared. And when the exhaustion of other armies reached its peak, Rome attacked. The impact wasn't only physical, it was mental. The enemy saw men who seemed carved from stone, immune to pain and fear did the rest. Roman training shaped the body, but above all, it shaped the mind. From the first day, a recruit learned that discomfort was not punishment, it was routine. Heat, cold, hunger, weight, none of it was considered suffering, it was instruction. During training, instructors would leave soldiers standing under the sun without allowing them shade, simply observing who endured in silence. Those who complained were isolated, not as punishment, but as a lesson. Shared pain strengthened the group, isolated pain destroyed it. The human body can endure far more than it believes. Rome knew this centuries before medical science existed. Soldiers were conditioned to understand their own sweat, to use heat as a signal rather than a warning. When sweat dried too quickly, it meant the body was losing water beyond its limit. When it ran slower, the body had adapted. Every drop was information. But the greatest secret was consistency. No legion ran under the sun. Running meant collapse. They marched in cadence, breathing in a fixed pattern. Inhale for 3 steps, exhale for 3 steps. A controlled, almost sacred rhythm. The sound of synchronized footsteps, combined with the echo of metal, created a kind of collective mantra. Marching became prayer, and prayer kept the body stable. Later accounts by military physicians, such as Galen, described Roman legionaries as having abnormal resistance to heat. This wasn't genetic, it was conditioning. A body trained to obey loses awareness of physical limits because the limit ceases to be individual. In the desert, the legion was a single organism, and if one man faltered, the system absorbed him, protected him, and moved on. Yet even Rome had limits. When the heat surpassed what could be endured, the enemy became invisible. Mirages blurred directions, the ground gleamed like metal, and the air vibrated in waves that distorted sight. It was like fighting inside a dream. In those moments, generals ordered strategic halts, not to rest, but to reorganize thought. The body could endure the heat, but the mind had to remember reality still existed. Legionaries used simple methods to protect themselves from the desert's madness. Many covered their heads with damp cloth strips. Others dipped their hands in the cold sand before dawn, when the surface had not yet heated. Small gestures that preserved control. In an environment where everything seemed to want you dead, control was the only form of victory. When the sun began to fall, the legions seemed reborn. The rhythm increased, formations tightened, and the heat, once an enemy, became an ally. The enemy, already exhausted, assumed Rome was just as weak. But the Roman body followed another logic. It conserved energy during the critical hours, moving at the edge of fatigue, then unleashed full strength as the desert cooled. It was the ancient equivalent of a combustion engine, storing heat and turning it into power. Tactics were adapted to the environment. Long spears which reflected sunlight were kept low to avoid blinding comrades. Shields were angled to direct hot wind upward. Spears and gladii were wrapped in damp cloths during marches to prevent the metal from expanding in the heat. Even the straps of the armor were greased with animal fat to keep them from drying and cracking in battle. Nothing in Rome was improvised, it was method. Heat, the invisible enemy, was studied with the same precision as rivers, fortresses, and armies. A Roman commander never asked if the heat would kill. He asked how to make it kill for him. And in a cruel, brilliant way, Rome discovered that heat could kill through fear before it ever killed through fever. The enemy saw Romans marching beneath the burning sun and thought, if they can endure that, what can't they endure? That was victory before battle.
The desert became a stage for propaganda, and every step was an act of psychological warfare. For others, heat was punishment. For Rome, it was propaganda.
When the sun set and the desert began to breathe again, Rome went to work. That was when heat stopped being a direct enemy and became a ghost in the air, an invisible force shaping every decision. The camp would rise like a city blooming from the sand. In less than 2 hours, thousands of men raised tents, dug trenches, lit fires, and enclosed the perimeter with wooden palisades. The precision was so absolute that every Roman camp, no matter where it stood, shared the same design, the same number of paces between tents, the same orientation toward the wind. Even the kitchens followed the dictates of the heat. Never in the center, always along the edges, where smoke could be carried away by the night wind and the heat from the fires dispersed. The officers' tents were placed where morning shadows lingered, taking advantage of the night's residual coolness. The common areas were organized into narrow corridors, channeling air between the rows. The wind entered through controlled openings and exited through side trenches. It was climate architecture before the concept even existed. The engineers called it castra ventus, the field of wind. It was as if every camp could breathe. In the morning, as the sun began to rise, the sand released its stored heat. Hot air lifted upward, and the cooler air from the corridors took its place. That simple difference in temperature created a continuous current of ventilation that kept the tents cooler. The Romans didn't know they were applying the principles of convection, but they mastered it as an art. Water storage was one of the most vital and carefully calculated tasks. Clay jars, leather skins, and wooden barrels were buried halfway into the sand. The earth acted as natural insulation, reducing the water's temperature by up to 10 degrees. Around them, damp cloths were stretched overhead, and soldiers took turns keeping them moist with small portions of their own supply. Waste was a military crime. Water was measured, guarded, and every drop had a destination. The legion marched with its own wells. Wherever terrain allowed, they dug shallow pits and covered them with stones to capture the dawn's dew, small quantities but enough for a guard shift or to wet one's face before marching. At night, when the temperature dropped sharply, the dry air condensed on metal and leather surfaces. Soldiers learned to collect this vapor as if it were treasure. Extreme heat was not met with brute force alone, but with meticulous intelligence. Marching routes, too, obeyed the physics of heat. Generals planned their paths according to wind direction and terrain slope. Walking with the hot wind at their backs meant faster dehydration. Marching against it, though exhausting, kept the body cooler. Columns were adjusted to follow the sun's rise and fall, and the distance between ranks changed with the temperature, tighter in cold days, wider in hot ones, to allow air to circulate between bodies. Weapons also demanded adaptation. Long spears left under the sun could warp. Shields made of wood and leather would crack, so soldiers covered them with damp cloths during pauses. Armor was lubricated with a mixture of fat and wax to keep the joints from drying out under the heat. Metal could never be left unattended. The sun could turn even protection into danger. In an environment where everything melted, even armor had to breathe. Horses and mules, essential for transporting equipment, had their own cooling systems. During marches, they were covered with white linen cloaks, and during halts, soaked with diluted vinegar, which evaporated more slowly than pure water. The Romans understood that heat did not distinguish between man and animal. A dead horse meant delay, and a delay could mean defeat.
Food was another challenge. Heat could turn nourishment into poison. To prevent that, the Romans created an almost industrial logistics system. Grains were stored in containers sealed with wax and buried partially to keep them cool. Meat was salted to the limit of taste and wrapped in cloths soaked with vinegar. The legion carried with it a microcosm of self-sufficiency, an artificial ecosystem capable of surviving for weeks under the sun without outside supplies. On long campaigns, engineers plotted routes based on the presence of seasonal rivers and shaded valleys. In some cases, they detoured for kilometers just to follow paths with cooler air currents. Thermal efficiency mattered more than speed. An army that marched slowly and arrived alive was more feared than one that rushed and died on the way. At night, the Romans made use of the desert's intense cold, the other side of the torture. The day's heat inverted into a cutting chill that froze the sweat still clinging to their sklun. The same system that protected them from the sun now saved them from the night. Double-layered leather tents that reflected heat by day now trapped the warmth of bodies inside. Fires were lit only enough to maintain temperature, never excess. Balance was the rule. Even in rest, heat was studied. Generals used simple instruments like thin bronze blades to measure variations in ground temperature. They would stick them into the sand and observe how long it took to heat up. It was a rudimentary but effective way to predict how the terrain would behave the next day. If the accumulated heat was excessive, they changed the route. Rome had a habit of winning before fighting. The result was almost supernatural. In campaigns described by Eastern chroniclers, enemy armies watched the Romans cross the desert for days without breaking formation. While the locals fell ill, dehydrated, and lost themselves in sandstorms, the legions advanced like a solid block. Where others saw hell, Rome saw a route. The desert, with its cruel laws, had made Rome an engineer, and of all ancient empires, none understood so deeply the truth that heat reveals. Those who master the environment have no need to fear the enemy. The desert was more than a battlefield. It was a temple. And for the Romans, fighting there was almost an act of faith. Heat, which for others meant divine punishment, became for them a ritual of purification. Every drop of sweat was an offering to discipline. Every step under the sun, a silent prayer to eternity. Rome had turned suffering into doctrine, and the human body into an altar.
Soldiers believed that heat separated the worthy from the weak. The gods, they said, did not protect those who begged for shade. They protected those who kept marching. The sun was the invisible judge that witnessed everything. To endure the desert was to prove one's worth before it. This belief was written in no law, but it lived in the marches, in the rituals, in the oaths. Before every campaign, the centurion made his men swear never to break formation, not before the enemy, nor before the sun. Heat was part of the pact. Roman discipline had something sacred about it. The one who disobeyed, who drank without permission, who abandoned his shield to seek shade, was punished not only with steel, but with shame. Individual failure was a spiritual flaw. Rome taught that a soldier no longer belonged to himself, he belonged to the legion, and the heat, merciless and constant, reminded him of that every second. During the campaigns in Egypt and Syria, legionaries began to develop personal rituals. Some drew small symbols inside their shields, marks representing endurance, fire, and iron. Others placed desert stones inside their canteens as mementos of what they had already conquered. Heat was no longer seen as an enemy, it was a trophy. The marches beneath the sun were silent. The sound of wind and footsteps was the only noise allowed. There was a somber beauty in that stillness. Thousands of men walking in unison, faces covered in dust, eyes half closed, armor flashing like lightning. The landscape became hypnotic. From afar, one could swear they were watching statues come to life. The peoples who faced Rome began to call them those who walk with the sun. No matter the heat, no matter the distance, they came, always. The enemy could wait in the shade, but shade saved no one when the earth itself was a furnace. The desert forgave no hesitation, and Rome never hesitated. That almost supernatural aura was used by the generals themselves. They knew fear was a weapon as powerful as iron. That's why they kept their legions marching under the midday sun, visible even when there was no tactical need. The gleam of armor, the blinding reflection of shields, the slow and relentless movement, all of it was deliberate. The enemy saw and believed they were facing something more than men. It was psychological theater on an imperial scale. But for the legionaries themselves, the heat was also a reminder of mortality. In an empire built on order and conquest, the sun was the one force no one could control. It stood above even Caesar. To march beneath it was to acknowledge one's own smallness, and yet to keep moving forward. That paradox, obedience and defiance, fear and faith, was the heart of the Roman identity. The cold nights came as a brutal relief. The heat vanished, and the desert became another world. The stars covered the sky like frozen blades. The legionaries, exhausted, gathered around small fires, not just to stay warm, but to remind themselves they were still human. The night fire carried a different meaning. It was the opposite of the sun, the temporary ally that restored the body. Some called those hours the breath of Mars. Mars, the god of war, was not only blood and glory, he was endurance. He was the spirit that marched even when the body wanted to stop. That's why many soldiers saw heat as a form of communion with him. The desert was the altar, and sweat was the sacrifice. Each sunrise was a new baptism by fire. And the hotter the day, the stronger the Roman spirit became. Records from some chroniclers suggest that during long campaigns, the legions would enter a kind of collective trance. Voices fell silent, eyes fixed on the horizon, and time itself seemed to stretch. It was a mental state in which the body simply obeyed, unaware of exhaustion. What moderns might call a flow state, Rome understood as pure faith, the triumph of the mind over the heat. This devotion was not blind, it was practical. Roman faith had always been faith in structure, in order, in repetition, and extreme heat, where any mistake meant death, was the perfect field to test that belief. Discipline ceased to be merely military and became spiritual. The desert was the confessional, where Rome purged its weakness. Officers knew that an army hardened by the sun was more dangerous than any elite troop trained in the north. The heat forged men who had already defeated their worst enemy, their own bodies. That's why when Rome fought in colder lands, it seemed almost effortless. The cold did not frighten those who had felt the iron of the desert in their veins. Rome did not see heat as an obstacle, but as a measure of worth. If a soldier could fight under 40 degrees, he could fight anywhere. This mindset created a kind of warrior who feared nothing, because he had already been tested by nature itself. And when the enemy saw that, men of iron walking through the desert as if heat didn't exist, they understood the message. No climate, no god, no despair could stop Rome. The sun sank slowly over the desert, painting the sky in copper and blood. The legions, covered in dust and dried sweat, kept marching in silence. Each step left a mark in the sand, a signature, a reminder that even heat could be tamed by human will. It was the end of the day, but also the portrait of the empire itself. A colossal body, weary yet unyielding, that never stopped. Rome had learned to do the impossible, to survive where the air burned, where water was treasure, and where the very ground seemed an enemy. It had turned the desert into a field of study, the heat into a teacher, and pain into a tool. And perhaps that was Rome's true secret, not iron, nor gold, nor power, but the profound understanding that survival begins within the mind. The body of a legionary was a machine of discipline, every muscle trained to obey before it complained, every breath measured to conserve life. Heat did not defeat him because he did not fear it. He studied it. He transformed it. Instead of fighting nature, Rome became part of it. And that fusion, man, iron, and sun, created one of the most relentless forces history has ever seen. Today, when we look at the deserts Rome once crossed, we still find traces, the outlines of camps, fossilized tracks, shards of pottery that once held precious water. All that remains are echoes of a vanished engineering, a science of survival the modern world has forgotten. We have built machines to cool the air, but we have lost the art of cooling the body. We build cities to defy heat, yet forget that heat is part of the earth and part of us. The Romans knew this without ever writing it in books. They understood that the human body could be the most efficient structure on earth if it were trained, disciplined, and respected. And while we hide from the sun behind walls and machines, they faced it bare-chested with iron and courage, not because they sought suffering, but because they knew that suffering shapes. Every battle won under 40 degrees was more than territorial conquest. It was a message for the centuries. Nature can be overcome, but only by those who understand it. The desert does not yield to shouting or machines. It yields to patience, strategy, and unity. Rome did not defeat the heat. Rome learned to speak with it. There was something poetic in that coexistence with hell. The legions marched among dunes that looked like seas of fire, and yet their rhythm never broke. When the sun reached its zenith, the ranks rotated like gears in a living machine. When the wind blew sand across their faces, shields rose as if with a will of their own. It wasn't heroism, it was calculation. And that is why Rome endured. The desert did not destroy Rome, it perfected it. Each campaign beneath the sun turned ordinary men into instruments of precision. The heat, which should have killed them, instead sharpened them like blades. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, we still look upon them with awe, because what Rome achieved in the desert was not merely war, it was the invention of control. In every grain of sand still resting upon the ruins of Rome's ancient roads lies the memory of a humanity that could endure more than we can, a people who understood the weight of the earth, the rhythm of the wind, and the fury of the sun, and made them allies. Their technology was the body, their faith was discipline, and their fuel was the will not to fall. If a Roman soldier could see our world today, he might smile, because he would recognize that we still fight the same enemies. Heat, time, exhaustion. Only the weapons have changed. Where they had armor and shields, we have concrete and glass. Where they marched in silence, we rush in haste. But the principle remains the same.
To endure. And perhaps that is the empire's true legacy. Not the conquests, nor the roads, nor the monuments, but the lesson left beneath the sun, that the human body, when molded by discipline and understanding of its environment, is more powerful than any machine. The sun, after all, was never the enemy. It was the master, and Rome its most devoted student. When the last ray of day touched the spears and made the iron glow like gold, it was not the heat that triumphed, it was will.
Because in the end, the force that kept the empire standing under 40 degrees did not come from metal or blood. It came from something the desert itself had taught. The body may yield, but the mind never does.